Three, two, one. Liftoff.
Welcome to the Ketamine Startup Podcast. I'm Kimberly Chan-Ko, and along with my partner, Dr. Sam Ko, we've had the privilege of helping doctors and other licensed medical professionals across the U.S. open their own ketamine therapy clinics. On this podcast, we share the realities of starting and running a ketamine clinic, marketing it, and more. In this two-part episode, we're reflecting on some of our most insightful and impactful moments from Season 1. You'll hear lessons on building a private practice, navigating the business side of ketamine therapy, mental health, personal growth, and the deep responsibility that comes with this work. If you're new to our show, welcome to the show. And if you hear something that resonates with you, check out the show notes. We'll list the full episode so you can dive deeper. Let's jump in. This clip is from episode 2 for Heroes and All Expanding Ketamine Therapy with Dr. Carl Bonnet.
Our latest push is we're really trying to get into law enforcement. So we're treating a series of police officers. We're going to be getting our IRB approval to publish a study on law enforcement. And just because too, I think we as society and taxpayers have an obligation to take care of them, right? Because from day one we know we're going to be putting them into a situation that's going to be enormous psychological trauma. But two, there's this huge societal aspect to that, where this individual is someone with a gun who's going out on the streets and interacting with our citizens, right? So if they're in a good headspace, they're going to be more likely to have very good, positive interactions. Whereas if they're if they're human beings, right? So if they're dealing with bad stuff, going through a divorce, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What concerns me is they're more likely to potentially get in an adverse situation with some civilian, who knows, it might be differences in, race, all this kind of thing.
Sure.
One thing leads to another, and then all of a sudden you got an incident, which then can have, riots, bloodshed, all this kind of stuff.
That's actually a really good point. I'd even consider the long-term ramification that if there is a police officer or a member of the sheriff or law enforcement, and they have all of these symptoms that aren't necessarily addressed, they might be in a kind of agitated state per se, rather than a calm, tranquil state, which could impact society. Other people. That's actually
so it's exciting stuff.
I'm curious. So you and I were both emergency physicians, and we use ketamine all the time: procedural sedation, intubation, sedation, etc. So, but the clinic setting in an outpatient is quite different. Yeah. So for you, what are some of the nuances between doing it in a hospital, like OR, ER style, versus like how you're doing it in the clinic for you?
It's not very often in history that some medication has one indication, just a whole way of using it, which then everything gets radically changed and it's just completely different. It is completely different what we're doing now versus what we're doing in the ER. In the emergency department, it's all about the intention. The intention is to sedate someone to allow us to perform a painful procedure, right? We're trying to drop them so we can do a painful procedure. Here, we're using the medication to create this sense of ego disillusion, ego disruption, to affect a whole different experience, right? So, we're not looking for a complete disconnection. Our patients, they're responsive to verbal stimuli. They should be able to ambulate with assistance. They get altered a little bit, but again, the goal, it's kind of like, for those of your viewers who know how to drive stick shift, which honestly may not be that many, I don't know. But when you hit the clutch on a stick shift car, you hit it all the way to the floor because you want to completely disengage the engine from the drivetrain and change gears.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we do in the ER.
Yeah.
Right. Here, we're just riding the clutch a little bit.
Interesting. I like that metaphor.
A little disconnection.
Yeah.
And, so it's just fundamentally different.
This clip is from episode 3. How much money do you need to start a ketamine clinic?
There's definitely a risk when someone is starting up a clinic. But I think the real key for us is keeping overhead very low, especially when you're first starting. I think that can play a really important role. Wearing a ton of hats and all of that will make it still risky, but reducing the risk, making it a calculated risk.
Because it goes both ways. There's the risk you may find that, hey, I can do this. I do it pretty well, but I don't want to do it anymore. For whatever reason, you realize this isn't for me. And having a lower investment makes the pain of stepping away yet again from something be a little bit less. Because sometimes you just don't know until you're in it As much as ask people that open ketamine clinics or go to conferences or maybe even get a treatment yourself because you have a diagnosis and you get a sense of how it goes and all of that. And you're like, hey, I could do this. Well, how many times have you said, oh, I can do this, and you tried it and you go, yeah, I now know why I don't do this for a living. Sometimes you don't know until you do it. And again, just that running a place with a low overhead makes this sting just a little bit less. And thankfully and luckily for us, we still like it. We find the joy of taking care of this patient population with this form of therapy, and being in this space that is ever growing is something we find very fulfilling inside the clinic and outside of it. But for some, it won't. And so, goes back to knowing who you are and keeping it lean, a lean business practice. And I'd say I wouldn't want to live in regret. So jumping into that what if, just going back to what you were saying, Sam, of like, oh man, I would be heartbroken if we had held back and then found out like another person opened up down the street. This clip is from episode From Combat to Care, a journey to providing ketamine therapy with Dr. Leslie Koenig.
I know personally that juggling running a business, operating a clinic, taking care of patients, family, kids. So what are you doing to balance all of this, and how are you juggling all the different hats you wear?
Oh, that's a great question. And I never would have anticipated this, but I feel like my spiritual practice has gotten deeper as I've opened this clinic. And I think that's just because that was an area of my life that I had neglected for so long, being in the ER. And so I've really surrounded myself with a spiritual community so that I can, I don't know, some of these things come up that are just amazing to me, like what I get to do for these patients and how soul filling it is.
Yeah.
So for me, that's been a wonderful way to, I don't know, open up a new side personally.
I love it.
So to really connect with that, as I'm helping others connect spiritually to themselves, it's funny how I end up doing the same thing.
Wow. Yeah. So as you're healing and supporting these patients of yours, it's also in a way like healing yourself.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
that reminds me of this classic archetype that Carl Jung talks about, the wounded healer, whereby the healer, by supporting and healing other people, that they're able to process and heal themselves in the whole journey for both the patient and the clinician providing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I never would have expected that.
Yeah.
But it's, as you do unto others, so you do unto yourself.
Yeah.
And so as I'm healing others, I feel like I'm getting to heal myself.
Yeah.
So, and that's where it's helped me find that balance between being the business owner of the family and solo independently going off on meditation retreats and solo hikes and things like that.
Yeah.
The books I'm reading.
That's
So,
awesome.
Yeah.
So self-care, but also juggling many things. That spiritual component is really, really crucial. So thank you for sharing that.
This clip is from episode 5, the 3 types of people who open up a ketamine clinic. A lot of people in the healthcare field were perfectionists. And, for the most part, we kind of feel that we need to, because if we're not on our A game, if we're not, bolstering our weaknesses, reading up, learning how we could be better, people die, people get maimed, people get ill and sick. But the thing is when you're starting a business, and especially those first few months and you're just starting out, you just really need to lean in on what you do well, because you're going to be juggling so much. The last thing you do is be, if you're like, oh, I'm so uncomfortable with trying to raise money and I don't know how to do this, or gosh, I don't even know how to do a website, you're going to be spinning your wheels. You need to take action. And so where you can take action is what you can easily and naturally do. And that is why partnering is so key at the beginning. And whether that is a formal business relationship or it's like a mastermind group, that's what's going to help you be the catalyst to get this actually going. And then here's the thing too. The longer you're in business, you just naturally are going to strengthen those other weak areas.
Yeah, totally. I think just to reiterate the point of building a team, knowing who you are, and then finding other people who can complement kind of your, weaknesses or strengths, so that you don't have like the same 3 archetypes in the business. I remember before we had actually launched back in, I think, 2016, 2017, I had contemplated opening up this ketamine clinic, and I was working with 2 other physicians. And I think the problem that it didn't work out with the other 2 physicians initially was we were both or all 3 of us were artists. And so we all kind of gravitated towards that, and we weren't aware of this concept of the archetypes and finding the right people on the team. And I think that ultimately led to that group kind of dissolving. We were all excited when we first started, but then ultimately it just kind of dissolved out. And fortunately, Kim was there and she backed me up, and we were able to co-create and start up Reset Ketamine in Palm Springs. And now we've been open for 5 years. And although Kim doesn't do any of the clinical stuff, she plays a huge role in the operation side, the management side, helping with optimizing everything, helping with the social media marketing, everything in that aspect. And again, so knowing who you are out of these three archetypes and then partnering with people who match you and who can complement you, I think it's really key for a successful ketamine clinic.
This clip is from episode 6, Transforming Pain Care, Insights into Ketamine Therapy and Business with Dr. Laura Ettinger.
For our listeners who don't know what CRPS is, can you just briefly tell us what that is?
Yeah, it's a neuropathic pain disorder. It stands for complex regional pain syndrome. It's a disorder that typically arises after an injury. It can be a very minor injury, most commonly after fracture. And it's basically a syndrome of inappropriate pain, where the pain just continues on and on and on. And it really is not regional. It really is a central nervous system problem. And you see all the subsequent signs and symptoms, which include, vasomotor symptoms, which is swelling, or not swelling, I'm sorry, but is temperature changes and color changes. And then you have pseudomotor and swelling, which is, of course, a lot of edema, spontaneous edema, particularly sweating changes. The limb often becomes very sweaty in comparison to the other one. And then lastly is motor trophic. And motor can be, a decreased range in motion that's really out of proportion to what happened, or it can be dystonia, it can be myoclonus, it can be rather dramatic.
Wow.
Rarely, but that can happen. And then, of course, trophic changes are reference to, the shiny skin that we typically see, increased hair growth, increased nail growth. So it's a very interesting disorder, and it's also often associated with other autoimmune diseases or conditions. So basically, that is what the majority of my population has. And then intermixed there is various other neuropathic pain conditions.
Yeah.
So,
And CRPS is pretty rare, I would say, or please correct me if I'm wrong. Do you know the prevalence? Is it 1%, 2%?
well,
I know it's
they say it probably occurs to some degree in about 2%
2%
of
of the
all
population.
injuries.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh,
But then it
there's-
often will kind of come up and then go away again, which
Mm,
we never capture those.
got it.
Those- we think that could happen. I've actually captured that twice,
Got it.
where I thought somebody was going to go into full minute CRPS, and for whatever reason they didn't.
Yeah.
Which was very interesting to see that. But, probably 2% probably captures those people who have some degree of allodynia or pain with light touch after a surgery or after an injury. And this population actually could be higher. I've heard that some people feel it's up to 15%.
Wow.
Which I think is really under-recognized.
So definitely the link of the autoimmune
Yeah.
conditions with
Yeah.
CRPS. Okay.
This clip is from episode 7, Who Can Open a Ketamine Therapy Clinic?
You might be thinking about going back to the corporate practice of medicine laws. Some of the states that have the most strictest CPOM laws are specifically California State, New York, Texas, and Washington with the strictest CPOM laws. The ones who don't have the CPOM is Florida.
And so I think one of the biggest takeaways you can get from this episode is a understanding that each state is different. So you may have a colleague that was like, oh man, it was super easy. I just opened it up. Or maybe somebody you went to college with who went into business and was like, I opened up a clinic in Florida and you're practicing in Texas as an anesthesiologist. Yes, it's going to be a different experience for you because there are different laws. And so just again, partnering with people, we're all about keeping overhead low, but this is one area you do not want to scrimp on and save. You want to find a person that really knows their stuff about the laws in relationship to opening a medical practice in your state.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of some of our patients who may come in and do an entire Google search, and then now they're the expert in a disease. And it's like, yes, they know a lot, but no amount of Googling is going to replace your professional medical expertise. Similarly, someone can Google a lot about state regulations, but they're not going to be the expert, right? And so we know this applies to us in the professional space, in the medical space. That also applies in the legal space. I do want to note that there is one workaround that I just want to touch upon. And the workaround for the states that we had mentioned that have corporate practice of medicine laws, there's something called a management service organization, MSO. And what an MSO does is they help a clinic and do the marketing, the HR, the operations, but they don't play a role in directing how that doctor practices medicine. So these CPOM laws were really designed to keep patients safe. They didn't want business professionals to like direct patient care. Now, again, this workaround is where the doctor would open up their own clinic and then create a contract with a management service organization through a management service agreement so that they're not doing any of the medical clinical stuff, but then they're kind of supporting in that administrative aspect. So that is one workaround because you may have, you may be living in a state with really strict corporate practice and medicine laws, but then you're like, well, it looks like they have other people running it. It's probably not. They probably have a management service organization with a management service agreement and where they're doing all of the background administrative side, but not directly impacting the patient care.
If you tuned in to our episode today, chances are you're curious about the ins and outs of starting up a ketamine clinic. It's an exciting field, but let's face it, the journey from idea to actually opening day can be quite daunting. That's why we've created something special for you. Think of it as your personal roadmap, a free downloadable checklist that lays out the essential steps you need to consider when starting up your ketamine clinic. This checklist is designed to help you avoid common pitfalls and launch your trajectory to success. So how can you get your hands on this checklist? Simple. Just visit www.ketaminestartup.com/checklist and grab your free copy today. We've made it easy and accessible because we believe in supporting our community with a valuable resource. ketaminestartup.com/checklist. All right, let's get back to our discussion. Stay tuned and don't forget to download your free checklist during or after the podcast. This clip is from episode 8, From the ER to Ketamine Therapy, Leading a Clinic and Balancing Life with Dr. Clara Imani.
What advice would you give to yourself 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that if you're like, hey, looking back at that former past Dr. Imani, what advice would I give her 2 years ago that you know now?
There's a plot twist right there. I would think, I do have to think about this because I was just thinking about what advice I would give to somebody else. And I would probably that would be the same advice to myself would be, if you're going into this, you're not going into this to get rich. You're going into this to help people. Remind yourself of that. I mean, yes, I still need to be able to pay for the cost and pay for my time that I'm not working clinically. But at the same time, just helping people and how much does that, like the satisfaction and like the happiness that brings me. I'm happier doing this. And at some point I was happy working in the ER and I still have those days, but I'm just happier now because I know that I can help in a different way. So just starting sooner, and getting things together. It took me a while and I think it's totally fine because things kind of worked itself out. And I was looking for ketamine clinic about a year ago and I couldn't find anything. And it just happened that now I'm at a really good spot and I'm loving where I am right now.
Yeah. And what I appreciate about that is sometimes someone who doesn't know about the ketamine space quite yet, they're like, I'm going to go make a bunch of money. It's cash pay. I'm going to, be able to retire on this. I'm going to be able to work 4 hour a week and just enjoy it. It's like a lot of work and it may not be as lucrative
Right.
as the traditional clinical job. I remember for me, when I was starting out 6 years ago, like I had an opportunity to be a medical director of a ED and it was quite high compensation. And I had to make a
Yeah.
decision like, do I do this, which has financially very rewarding, but emotionally, spiritually not rewarding. And I think that emotional, spiritual
Right.
nourishment that, it sounds like we both receive from treating patients, like that's priceless in a way.
That is so true. And I had a similar event that I was about to take a job that I was going to be a medical director at a facility that we had to move cities. And that was going to be high anxiety. And I thought about it. And I'm like, that's not going to bring me that gratification of me being able to have my own clinic and treat clients and bring them happiness. That just brings me happiness. So it was totally worth it.
Yeah.
That I took this route instead of the other route.
Yeah.
This clip is from episode 9, Healing Journeys, Ayahuasca, Ketamine Therapy, and Spirituality with Dr. Joe Tafur.
Somebody brought it up to me the other day. I was on this Zoom podcast type of thing, and the guy was asking me about being an ayahuasquero, like working in the ceremony and the Shipibo tradition. And so he said, if you're opening those spaces and places and you're doing that kind of thing, don't you think that comes with a certain sacred responsibility? So yeah, traditionally, yes, that is, I mean, not everyone necessarily carries that. Not everyone lives up to that, but there is. So I think there is a big responsibility to try to do it well, to do it right, because talking about opening people up to the high level of vulnerability. So why the resistance around opening these states, in general? Because it's through our vulnerability that we are able to access these things. Once you're really bringing people into that vulnerability, and that's vulnerable. And so there's a big responsibility around people's safety, being responsible, being confidential, taking care of their vulnerability in a way that really respects that. And then there is going to be a sacred element that is going to enter their field, that they could say, "Oh, I don't want to be involved in anything spiritual. This is just medical practice." Although, as we're learning, they're just entwined. When this biopsychosocial spiritual, it's always there. It's going to happen. You're going to have, if you have a clinic like that and you think, "Oh, this is basically McDonald's and we just offer the same thing to everybody, and don't worry, it's just as long as we deal with the customers, that it'll all be the same across the board." But it's somebody in one of the rooms is going to, once in a while, it's going to have an out-of-body experience. Somebody in another room, once in a while, it might talk to a deceased loved one. Somebody in the other room is going to have this cert. These certs are going to happen from time to time. And so you're going to have to feel that a little bit. So just to open yourself to that. And that the last piece is that as all that's going on, to help people through those states, it's probably very helpful to have personal experience with that to some degree, to be able to be there for somebody through that, to have an idea that you would have some experience with the non-ordinary and be open to that for yourself, because you may have to go into some vulnerable places with somebody else that is going to take you into your own vulnerability.
This clip is from episode 10, Can My City's Population Support a Ketamine Clinic?
It takes a lot of courage to start something new, a ton of courage. And I love this concept about courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in the face of fear. So as you think about this and the risk, one new perspective to take is, hey, this is kind of exciting. This is kind of like an adventure, right? And so that's one frame of mind that you can take in. One example would be, let's say hypothetically that every time you go to Las Vegas and you play the slot machine and every single time you win. Like that would be fun for maybe, the first 5, 10, 20 times. But let's say it happened 100 times, 1,000 times. And now you're like, oh my gosh, this is so boring. Every time I go play the slot machine, like I know I'm going to win. Like there's going to come a point in time when it's like, you know what? That's no longer fun anymore. And the reason I bring this up is that when there is uncertainty, there is a bit of fun. When we don't know the outcome, that's actually kind of exciting, which is like why we like movies.
This clip is from episode 11, From Anesthesia to Entrepreneurship, Providing Mindful Holistic Ketamine Therapy with Dr. Sarah Herman.
And you did have your own personal ketamine experience, and you mentioned you're like, man, I could do this way better. And one of the things that I've noticed about you and your practice is you seem to be paying really conscious attention to the set and the setting. So tell us about that, about what do you do to optimize that, and maybe some of the experiences that you've also personally had and how you intertwine it into your practice.
Yeah. So I just always thought music, first of all, is a huge piece for any psychedelic journey. And so really curating music for the arc of both the individual session and the arc of the client journey over weeks or session to session is really important. I try to make things feel very organic in the office, but there's a lot of plants and it feels lots homey, and it has some elements of design that I've just picked up from here, there, everywhere, just traveling in the outside of the country, usually for most of the things that I've just tchotchkes and lots of third eyes everywhere because I just resonate with the third eye. And so I just follow my own gut instincts for what I think is going to feel right for people. I think one of the biggest issues with my personal ketamine journey was the lack of eye mask. There was no eye mask. There was no music. The doctor was talking about politics and COVID, and it was really awkward. He was asking me while I was on the infusion, how many sessions can he charge my card for? It was just really weird. Yeah, it was super weird and uncomfortable. And I just kept thinking to myself, yeah, if I need to rip out this IV, I know where I'm running. Yeah, so it just didn't feel safe, I was watching the doctor more than I was paying attention to what was happening. And so I think that building the trust and safety in the container is probably the biggest piece in creating a center or a sanctuary, if you will, for people to journey, because they need to feel really safe and held.
This clip is from episode 13, From CRNA to CEO, Blazing Trails in Ketamine Therapy with Catherine Walker.
You want to make sure your people are safe and that they trust the environment that they're in. So I think that's the biggest thing. You got to make sure your patients are safe. And if your patients aren't safe, or if they feel something, and this is, you know this, Sam, being in the ketamine space. There's a lot of different personalities that walk through those doors. If people give you impression that there's something that you could do differently to make them feel safer, then it's listen to that. Don't be like, oh, it's them or whatever else. There's something about something, even if it's like the shade of a light, but it's something that these people are trying to feel comfortable with, to express to you. And instead of providers like we are in the hospital, we're like, just get over it. You're having surgery today. You'll be fine. You have that capacity now to listen to that person and to try to understand that person's the impression of what's around them. So I think that's a big piece too, is we do have so much freedom, but it's our responsibility with that freedom to make sure that we're not only empowering ourselves, but we're empowering our patients and our employees around us. And I think that's your gold right there. Those are the most important parts for sure.
This clip is from episode 14, Ketamine Controversies in the Media, Debunking Myths and Embracing Reality.
So what do you think a ketamine clinic owner should be aware of, Kim, as they're navigating these waters?
Ketamine's going to be in the media. And I know for some folks, the idea of, not only am I having to run a business and hire folks and schedule patients, but gosh, I got to market. And then I'm going to have to deal with PR when there's some sort of misuse or misquote about ketamine, and then how poorly that can affect us. You know what? That's life. Unfortunately, I think that goes back to, if you find this idea of, this kind of sucks to have to deal with bad PR for ketamine, then maybe you shouldn't open up a ketamine clinic. It's just part of doing business. And honestly, good or bad, you're going to have an uptick on your visitors to your website. You're going to have more questions, patients calling in, or we always ask, how did you find out about us? Or how do you know about ketamine? And they'll be like, I heard after Matthew Perry's unfortunate death, made me go, what is this? Like some folks, it's any PR is good PR for some. And I think having just a plan and recognizing that I may, as a business owner, as a person that owns a ketamine clinic, I may have to be prepared to make a statement or have something, be prepared to talk with my patients, letting them know. And this goes back to communication. It goes back to re-educating or dispelling myths and misinformation. Because some of it is just, if you take it out of context, or if you put the same medication in a different setting. So we love talking about set and setting in this podcast. And if you think about it, ketamine therapy in a clinic with a healthcare provider with expertise and experience with ketamine therapy and having a patient with high doses is a very different experience, very different occurrence than an individual by themselves at home with large doses and whatever the outcome may be. And just being able to talk about this, really ingesting the information about appropriate use, and so that you can actually converse and talk to your patients, and also be able to converse with your staff, because guess what? You're not going to be the only one talking to your patients and potential public. We hope these insights gave you something to think about, whether you're considering opening up a ketamine clinic, already running one, or just curious about the space. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll continue sharing some of our favorite moments from this past season. And if today's clip stood out to you, be sure to check out the show notes for links to the full episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.